Going to start off our SourceOne build, installing our motors onto our arms, find the correct screws, check our screw length. The 4mm there looks pretty good, so I use the 4mm ones that come with the motors. Get a little bit of Loctite. Tiny little smear on the end of the screw. These motors have got a little LED on the other side. You can place whatever colour you want on the shield that they offer. Going to get our soft mount motor guards. Slip them on. Mount the motor to the top side, like so. Screw goes through. Snip it up, just snug, not too far. Next screw diagonally across from it, just nipped so we don't cross thread anything. Check everything's aligned. Once you've got all four in, the clearances look good. Put them up tight. And we rinse and repeat that 4 times. motors installed, ready to go.
Sorry? I'm trying to shoot a video here for work, so if you have to throw anything out, can you make sure?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Next step we're going to do is install the arms onto the frame. It's going to go on the top, this one on the base plate, like so. Screw comes up from underneath. This X on the bottom, arm in the center. On the top, as so. There's a slightly longer screw here on the back. That one's going to be too long, it's not that one. That one looks about just right. Put one screw on at a time here. Not going to do them up tight. Just going to get them in the right place. The basis for our frame. Next step will be to form the slightly longer screw. The second one that goes through the arm is going to protrude a little bit so that we have something to screw on to hold our stack together. You can use a longer screw here that don't supply any with the kit, but if you want to use some really long ones, that's another way of doing it. We can do it slightly different with what we have. But there's a few different ways to achieve the same result. There we go. Already installed, the motors to go. We're going to move on now to preparing our 4-in-1 ESC. ESC we're going to be using today is the Zeez 4-in-1 60 amp with heatsink. There's no right or wrong way to install this, but you do need to observe all the correct polarities, especially on the main tab. I think we're going to go heatsink facing up, so we've got easy access to this port here. So the first thing I'm going to do is take a little bit of our flux here and just smear a small amount on the main copper tabs. We'll be doing our high current connections too. Don't need much, it'll help you get a nice clean joint. Use our trusty TS100 and we're going to use the chisel tip. I guess it's not a true chisel tip, it's got a nice big flat surface. So we'll heat that up. Going to run it at about 360, 380. Our solder here. Clean our soldering iron off. Make sure we're tinned really well. I'm just going to go ahead and apply a little bit of solder to all the pads, pre-tinning the pads. Negative one will always take a little bit more heat than the rest of them. I have my extraction fan on here to try and draw away some of the fumes. Let's get all our main connection points tinned.
ready to go. Alright, next step is to determine our orientation on the SourceOne. You can see the slots at the front here of the frame. These are where camera plates go, so this is going to be the front of the frame. I'm choosing, for ease of orientation and build, to place my XT60 connector, or my main connector, at the rear of the frame. We'll run the lead out of the back. So what we're going to do is mount that now so that we can hook all our motors up. Got some little plastic standoffs here. We're going to screw them onto the screws for the stack that are protruding. Once we've got those guys in place, I'll position this. I'm just going to take a screw just to hold it in place, a bit easier. Put one in each corner, all diagonal opposite corners. Okay, I'm going to take our wires from the motor and take the one furthest away, drape it with a little bit of slack, snip it to length. Expose the tip a little bit. Don't have to use flux here, but it does give you a bit of a nicer finish. I'll just put the tiniest little smear on it. Get my soldering iron. Just tin the tip of it a little. Don't have to put a lot on, it just helps keep all the hairs in place. And then position it on and heat it up till it heats up the solder that you already have on the pad. It sinks down nice and smooth. Repeat the same, remembering to leave a little bit of slack there, you don't want these lines too tight. Keep your solder tip clean in between these moves. A little wipe into some steel wool, some brass wool, or a damp sponge will help. Keep the solder tip nice and clean. Stop it from oxidizing. Don't have to be too concerned if we're running BL Heli ESCs, which we pretty much all are now, with wire ordering. I like to solder the wires to the correct ESCs, but even if you didn't do that, you can remap your ESCs later. But the one thing that would confuse people from the past is which wire goes to which tab. Well, with BL Heli it doesn't really matter. We can set motor rotation easily through a change in software rather than physically swapping the wires to reverse or do a motor rotation. So it used to be in times past that if the motor wasn't spinning the way you needed it to spin, you would swap two of the wires over. It would spin the other way. You can still do that if you choose, but it's just as easy to solder them all up to the correct tabs and then swap it in the configurator in BL Heli configurator later, BL Heli suite. Okay. Something else you can do here at this stage, or the stage just before you mount the arms on the frame, if you wanted to, you can pop some large heat shrink over the arm itself and actually shrink the wires down to the arm. It does make it a little bit neater. The only downside is if you damage a motor, you'll have to take the arm off if you want to put shrink on again, especially with an arm that has a very large end on it. It's hard to get your shrink over that. But aesthetically it's quite pleasing and it does offer a little bit of protection. We're not going to do it on this one, we're going to just pop the zip tie over to keep the wires down out of the way of the props. You can see here that I'm soldering over the top of my ESC there. You have to be very careful when you do that you don't lose any solder down into the ESC, especially if it's got a heatsink there. The last thing you want is a nice blob of solder on the components that are supposed to be clean and doing all your switching for you. So don't do what I do as I say, and solder it over an area where any potential for dropped solder is not going to damage any existing components. Once again, a little bit less is more with solder. Don't go overboard on it. It can be tempting to do so. You'll find flux will give you a nice joint, even if you have to reflow it a couple of times. What's most important is that it's nice and shiny, it doesn't appear cold, and if you give it a good yank, it's not going to crumble or pop off. Really important with certain ESCs too that you don't allow the solder to get too close, as sometimes the MOSFETs or some of the switching components are very close. Their pins and their connections are very close to the solder pads. This is especially the case on 20x20 stacks and stacks that are a little bit smaller. As everything gets smaller, everything has to naturally become a little bit closer together, and you don't want to be heating up these pads for too long either. So if you're struggling to get some heat into the copper bus, you either need to run a little bit hotter, or you need a cleaner soldering tip, and flux does help as well, or possibly need a different style tip. I choose to use this big flat chisel tip because it's got good surface area and it contacts very well and very quickly. Doesn't take long to heat up a big bit of copper with it. You may find the wire gets a little bit warm when you're holding it. Tweezers help a lot there. Help you position it and hold it in place. Last one now. There we have it. Motor wires all connected to our ESC. Ready to go. And this Zeez stack. Already connected your XT60 which is a nice little perk. Some stacks will require you to make your own, or you may source your own. Length here may be of a concern depending on how you choose to run it out. We're going to run it out next to one of the standoffs here and have it come up the side a little bit. The other way you could do this is to turn the 4-in-1 90 degrees and the lead could come straight up off the pads and go straight up to the battery off the side there. Neither way is wrong or right. You just need to, as always, keep an eye on where your leads are and where your props are. Very important here, obviously, if your connector's been put on for you, it's definitely worth double checking that the red wire is definitely the positive. Every now and then they may get it wrong, and having it wrong at this stage will mean potentially a damaged part, maybe even a fire. So positive connector, negative connector. Colors are correct. We're going to find the positive pad, which is this one here. I'm going to place it there and try and get as much heat as we can into it as quickly as possible. Get it to sink down and hold it still as it cools. Same with the negative. Always takes a little bit more heat to get into the negative. You'll feel the solder give. Hold it while it cools. Alright. And that's the switching parts done. Next we'll look at the flight controller. I'm going to add one more thing to this build, which is a little bit of extra capacitance on the main leads. A very good idea, especially if you're going 6S, not always necessary on 4S, but can't hurt. So the first thing I do is snip the legs off my capacitor. I prefer to do it this way because it gives you a little bit more durability. You can solder those legs directly onto your input pads, but this way I find you have a little bit of flexibility and the chances of it coming off are reduced, or breaking the leg itself. Just tin those legs there a little bit. I'm going to just get some scrap cable, at least 20 gauge, preferably 18 if possible, AWG, and then just solder it onto the legs of your capacitor. Keep an eye on your cap. All the caps we use here will be polarized, usually a good low ESR electrolytic. This cap comes with the flight controller. It's 35 volts, 470 microfarads. Can be a little bit bigger, but the general rule of thumb is at least half again as big of in terms of voltage compared to your input. So 35 volts would be okay for 6S input. However, you would probably find 50 volts or more would be ideal. Your transient spikes that can come off the motors and your ESCs can be significant, so having a higher dielectric rating doesn't hurt. Let's leave it at that. Now you can see there's potential for a short across those legs if they were to be bent. So simply we're going to pop a little bit of heat shrink over those just to stop it from being able to arc out short across anything. A little bit of heat shrink on the boom itself. Make sure it seats nice and tight all the way down, and then just hit it with your heat gun or your soldering iron, whatever method, cigarette lighter. Repeat for the other leg. And find the leg that's marked negative and make sure you marry it up to the negative pad on your XT60. Ideally you want to keep these leads as short as possible. They do operate better in that instance. A little bit of flux, just tinning the pads, making sure there's no stray hairs. I'm going to check my polarity. This is a negative, it's going to go on the negative. A little bit of heat to seat it in, but not so much that you lose your connection off your main XT60 lead. If necessary, you can add a little bit of solder there as well. Okay. Probably pop a little bit of shrink over that or zip tie it down once we have everything in place in order so that it can't flop around. Alright. Next step we're going to do is move on to the flight controller. I generally like to do this as a separate little entity. While I'm also looking at a schematic of it so that I have an idea where all of the connections are and how they can be made. Since this was designed to work directly with this stack, the interfacing cable should plug straight in and relay all our information we need from the 4-in-1 directly to the flight controller without having to marry that up. Okay, you can get a schematic off Zeez's website in regards to what all the pinouts are on this Zeez stack. You'll also notice that it has options for LEDs on the underside, just plug and play for smart LEDs. But what we're going to focus on first of all is our camera connection up the top here, our video transmitter connection, and also our receiver connection over here. Before we do any of that, you need to have a look at the selectable pads which are here and here. And these are here so that you can select a voltage out essentially for your receiver and for your video transmitter. So knowing that our video transmitter is a vBat video transmitter, I'm going to solder directly onto the pin out there and bridge it from the center pad across to vBat, and this essentially allows it to transmit full vBat power to the VTX. If we go the other way, it does 5 volts. If you have a 5 volt VTX, that's what you do. So we bridge that connector there. I'm going to go and do the same for the receiver. This build we're going to use FreeSky, and that is a 5 volt receiver. You would only really use 3.3 volts for some Spectrum receivers. So nearly everyone here will bridge the RX pad here across to 5 volt. Okay. Our camera will run off 5 volt, and 5 volt ground and cam in is what we're going to use. If you want to do cam control, they have that option in some spots. I tend not to bother with it. So tin the 3 pads that we'll use for the camera input, and we'll tin the, I'm going to use 3 pads, or 4 pads actually, So video power in, ground, video out, and UART3 for our smart audio, or in this case we're going to use IRC Tramp protocol to control the VTX remotely. So you've got all of that soldered up and tinned, ready to go. When it's the first time doing a flight controller, it's not a bad idea to just place it on to get an idea of how far the cables will need to stretch, a dry fit as it were. Runcam Eagle 2 Pro will come with its own wiring harness. Most of the camera wiring harnesses are universal. They'll be input voltage, ground, and then video signal. So we'll find that plug, which goes into here like so. And that uses all of them. In this case, since we only need 3, that's what we're going to use. I'm just going to use the little 3 plug. So I get an idea of where the camera's going to mount, which is going to be around here. That gives us plenty of cable. I like to twist the cable here. There's a few advantages to that, but the most obvious one being that it's just a little bit neater. And I'll get an approximate length, leaving a bit of room for slack and play. Just carefully expose all the wires. A little bit of flux on all of them. We're using the finer tip now. I find it's a lot easier to do small work with this. I'm just going to tin those wires just to seal them up. Make the process a little bit easier. Find our flight controller here. Find our first connection, which is going to be voltage into the camera. We've preset this on the pads on the flight controller to be 5 volts in. So 5 volt in, ground, and the video line. That's it, our camera cable's on. We can go to our receiver. I'm going to use the trusty RXSR. It's important to note on the RXSR that first and second pins are negative and positive input. The third pin is for smart audio, which is a telemetry feature and is not your control link. A lot of people get that confused. The fourth pin on the RXSR, marked S-Bus in, is actually where you want to hook up to your control UART. I'm going to do a small modification to the cable. We're going to remove the lines we don't need. So essentially, don't need the last cable. I'm just going to pop the pin out and around. So we've got our cable there. I'm going to mount our receiver at the back of the drone here, so give ourselves plenty of cable to work with. Remember, you can always cut something a bit shorter, but if you cut it too long, if you cut it too short, you have to extend your cables, which is a bit of a pain and never as neat as it could be. Now we can't hook smart port, which is the telemetry function of this receiver. We can't hook it up to the same UART, so if we want to use that as a separate function to receive information from our drone via our control link, we need to pick a separate UART for that. Unless we're using some of the newer protocols, which I believe do allow bidirectional communication over it. We're not. We're going to stick with the standard D16. Most people will be familiar with. So once again, we'll tin our pads here for our receiver. Ground, voltage in TX and RX. However, we are only going to receive signals. You can actually direct solder some receivers directly onto this. It looks like it's made to do a crossfire receiver very easily. I'm going to do ground, voltage, and our control link to the RX pin. Easy way to remember that is your receiver is receiving information and it's sending your information to the flight controller to interpret. So the flight controller is receiving information from the receiver, obviously. So your control line or your S-bus line needs to go to the RX pad. Now, just confirming on the schematic, I note that this is UART 2 TX and UART 4 RX. So they've done a nice little mapping there which allows us to solder all our wires to the same spot, which keeps it nice and neat. And UART 2 will turn on smart port, and UART 4 will turn on S-bus. So there's that. Now, last thing we're going to add is our video transmitter wires. The video transmitter we're going to use is Panda RC1. We'll change the antenna over, MMCX. And you can see our input here, 6 to 26 volt ground, RX or smart audio control, or in this case tramp control. Video out at 5 volt, which we won't need, ground and video. So really the only wires we need off this are the voltage wires, so that we can power it. The third wire, which is white in this instance, which does our smart audio or tramp, so essentially smart control of our VTX. And the last wire, which is our video wire, which we will send a video signal from the FC, which is coming from the camera to the FC, so the FC can overlay the OSD on it, and then out of the camera to the video transmitter, so it can send its signal wirelessly out to our receivers. One of the little things I'm in a habit of doing is twisting the ground and the video lines together. This is not necessary, but it can in some instances offer a little bit of shielding. Keep your signal as clean as possible. And it won't hurt it either way. So a bit of flux on those wires. Tinning those wires. These tips here have already been designed to be soldered on, so they've already been stripped. So we selected vBat on the selector pads on here, which means our video transmitter when soldered to this pin will give us full voltage. Since this is a 4S build, that's more than enough. Ground connected. Smart audio is going to go to UART 3. Take our video line. We take our video line. A bit longer than I want it there, so just trim it to the size. Solder that onto a video pad. Take the ground. Hey, sorry, I'm just on a video for work. How's your walk? Alright, so that's all soldered up now. And we can remove the 5V out of the VTX wiring harness. We don't need that. I'm not going to use it in our instance. So there's our flight controller, ready to go. Next step will be to mount it on this. The last thing we will do just before this is give it a quick clean with some isopropyl. Spray some isopropyl on. This is just to help get rid of all the leftover flux that may still be there. It's not essential, although that flux is quite sticky. If you've used a good no clean flux, it's not going to be critical that you do this, but it's still not a bad idea. I'm just using the Q-tip here to get in around the board, and it's another good time to be able to inspect your solder quality, make sure that all the connections are solid and that nothing's bridged. Alright, so the next step will be mounting your flight controller. So I've removed the temporary screws that were holding our 4-in-1 on, and I'm using a little spacer kit that we provide. We sell it at Phaser, just to make sure that we have enough clearance between our flight controller stack and the 4-in-1. Our components aren't touching. I'm going to use some little plastic screws here. You can cut them to length. Each build will vary a little bit, but essentially you will have our screw passing through to a little spacer, which will then go into the standoffs. And the idea is not to do them up too tight. You don't want to be squishing the gummies on the flight controller and actually reducing the whole idea of having a soft mount system. So the clearance looks good on that. I don't need to change the length of screws at all. They're not going to bottom out. Obviously there's multiple different ways to do this, and your build may vary slightly. You might choose to use some really long stack screws. You might choose this method where you come at from the top and don't use a nut to hold everything on. You use a bolt or a screw. What's important is that your flight controller has good clearance. It can freely wiggle there a little bit within its parameters, and that its soft mounting isn't negated by it touching anything. Looks like we lost spaces there. Must have fallen out as we were wiggling it around. Put that into place. Okay. We have our cable here as well, plugged into the flight controller. And you check the orientation on the pins to make sure you're not going to bend anything. I'm going to plug that into the 4-in-1. At this stage the bulk of the work is done, and the rest is pretty much just mounting and connecting all the things to the appropriate places and the setup. I always like to at this stage go and check my flight controller software out and just check all my motors are working correctly. I do this through a fused input. In this case we have a benchtop power supply. You could use a smoke stopper or a similar device to limit current, so that if there is an issue with any of your work or any of the parts, it doesn't short, cause damage, and you can rectify it before you actually go and plug high amperage capacity battery into it that could potentially do some damage very quickly. So we'll stop there and I'll go and check it all out. Everything there checked out nicely. It's working well. So just a bit of mechanical now. We're going to go and put all our standoffs in. Refer to a picture of the SourceOne if I'm not sure where these will go. I'll find a pack of standoffs in the kit. Find the appropriate screws. Screw them in by hand, and then we can nip them tight. See how they're all in place. Make sure there's a decent amount of thread that comes up through the frame. Want a fair amount of meat connecting it, as opposed to just a couple of turns. That'll never last long in a crash if there's very minimal screw going into the standoff. So the screws are quite long, sticking out probably 8mm or so if you pick the right screw. Giving it plenty of purchase on the standoff. And the last two at the back. There's two ways you can do this. So we're going to use a print on the back here. You can slide these standoffs into the print,
or we can screw them onto the frame and then slide the print over the standoffs fixed in place. The print allows us to attach our antenna connection a little bit easier, cleans it up, gives us mounting spots for video antenna as well as control link antennas at the back. Depending on what type of control link you use will depend on which print you pick. We do another one that has a mount for the Immortal T for Crossfire users. And this one's a generic one that we're going to use for RXSR. Okay, next step will be to have a look at your camera mount. You'll notice there's a little slot in the bottom of the frame. Your two camera mounting pads that come with the SourceOne should fit into here. And there's a hole in the center there and a variety of different mounting arrangements depending on what sort of camera angle you like, how you'd like to fly. So the picture seems to indicate that arc would go at the back. And it will depend on what camera you use and how you like to mount it, but you should be able to come up with a solution to mount your camera, fix it into place. The little screw they use is a little 1.5mm driver. Get it into place. Screw I've picked is one of the longer ones. He's bottoming out on the frame, so we're going to go with the shorter ones. Sometimes you have to get a little bit creative here with washers and stuff. Depending on what gear you use, you'll figure out an optimal arrangement. You don't want to do them up too tight because when we go to put that top plate in, we need to get those in place. Sometimes if they're pinched too tight, we can't do that. Alright, so you've got an idea how your camera mounts now. We can take our camera plug, and we want to, because it's only a 3 plug going into a 5 port, we want to make sure it's plugged all the way into the left, into the correct pins. Otherwise we could be powering it incorrectly and could even damage it or the flight controller. So marry that plug up in the right place. Get it to fit back in the frame, tuck your cable in the way. We'll then find our video receiver link, which is here. We've got a few different options of how you can mount this, but we're going to just mount it underneath here in the frame. Carefully remove our MMCX connection without damaging it. We're going to find a video antenna and our cable that we're going to use. This cable is going to come up through the mount. I'm going to pick a couple of short screws to hold it in place. This stops it twisting. If we move or replace the antenna at any given time, there's less chance of damaging things. It's a very good way to securely mount your antenna so that it is replaceable easily or for a different purpose. And we get an idea of where we can optimally mount this. I like to carefully plug in our MMCX and then figure out an orientation that works. It looks pretty good to me there. And what we'll do is we'll secure it with some double-sided tape and a little zip tie. Find our plug, check the orientation of the way it goes in, insert it in, and then figure out
Okay, the last thing you're going to really plug in here is your receiver, which we have here. Plugs in like so. I believe the RXSR has a coating on it. However, I always like to put a little bit of heat shrink over it anyway, just to keep it from shorting out on the frame. Clear heat shrink is the best because you can see the light on it. Take note when you're building, the bind button on this guy is down in the corner here. I want to have him visible so we can do our bind later on. A couple of different ways you could mount this guy. Ideally you want to get the antennas out into the open where they'll be free from obstructions. This print has some options for that down the bottom. It's designed to be used with some antenna tubes as well. So the active part of the antenna is the last section that has clear shielding on it. That's the important part. We want to keep that section straight as possible and out and away from the frame itself, out in the open. It's got a clear unobstructed view. Never power your video transmitter up without an antenna on. It's never a good idea. Some transmitters are designed to be resilient to that, but I always like to use caution there and pop it on before I know I'm going to power it up. The final step in completing your frame should be relatively straightforward. You find your top plate, make it fit. And what we're going to do is run a little zip tie here to hold the lead to the leg so that it's clear of the prop. Other options include coming out of the back or coming up from the side. There's a number of different ways you can do it there, but that's essentially it, guys. Once your screws are on, you'll pop your props on, you've checked your motor direction, you'll set up your flight controller and your switches and bind and make sure everything's working, you make sure your video's working, power it up and do your first test hover.